Welcome to Things You Don't Know. Today, I am honored to have with me my fellow team members, Chandler Foster, a recent graduate of one of my alma maters, Emory and Henry University, and my world-class historian and friend, Dr. Sean Deneen. Today, we're going to look in one of the most famous mysteries in early American history, the lost colony of Roanoke. Yeah, this is one of those stories people think they know in a single image. A deserted settlement, no colonists, and one word carved left behind. But once you look closely, the mystery becomes less a ghost story and more a survival story, an empire story, and a communication failure. Can you help me out here, Chandler?
Yes, I can, Dr. Weaver. Now, I want to start off just by saying that this is one of those cases where mystery can mislead us a little bit. The colonists did not necessarily vanish into thin air. What really happened may be more historically ordinary, even if it is still unresolved. Movement, splitting up, dependency on native communities, hunger, fear, weather, and bad timing. That all may be less theatrical, but it's actually a lot more believable. Wouldn't you say, Dr. Deneen?
I certainly would. That's exactly the right frame to have, Chandler. Roanoke sits at the intersection of English ambition and English weakness. England wanted a foothold in North America, an advantage over Spain, future trade and privateering bases, and to prove it could compete in the Atlantic world. But wanting an empire and being able to sustain one were not the same thing in the 1580s.
Leave it to you, Dr. Deneen. You can pull in four different countries if you want to at a moment's notice. Thanks. But yeah, I think you bring some good insight to that. But I wonder, why was it called Roanoke?
Well, before we get to the disappearance, let me ask a question that the listener may be wondering, but they might not think to ask. Why was it even called Roanoke at all, Dr. Deneen?
I wonder, before you even get to that, Chandler, when I say Roanoke, I think of Roanoke, Virginia.
I do too. It's not right in my backyard, but it's kind of right here. I can get to it with a hop, skip, and a jump.
Yeah. So I think that was borrowed, right?
Well,
Absolutely.
y- you're both more or less right. The careful answer is that Roanoke was an indigenous name already associated with both the island and the people in the region before the English made it famous. As with so many other places, the English adopted a native place name rather than inventing one from scratch. As for the meaning, scholars are a little cautious about that. The Encyclopedia Britannica notes that the name is probably Algonquin in origin and may mean northern people, though it has also been rendered as the place where shell beads may be found, which Native American tribes used as currency at that time. So the honest scholarly answer is that the English borrowed the name, but the exact original meaning remains a little unsettled.
I don't know if you've been to Norfolk or that area of Virginia, Dr. Deneen, but on the beaches there, and I'm sure you have, Chandler,
Oh,
you,
yes, I have.
what do you find on the beaches there? Shells
Shells, lots and lots of them too.
and shell beads also.
Yes.
So it's part of Virginia, which I think is perhaps made some crossover to Roanoke, Virginia, possible, which is a railroad center and some other things too. Anyhow, the name itself reminds us of something easy to forget. Roanoke was not an empty stage waiting for English history to begin. The English entered a native political world that already had its own geography, alliances, When we say alliances, the Virginia Algonquins, sometimes called Powhatans, they had an alliance, a confederation, if you will, of around 15,000 tribes. Yeah, imagine that. We don't ever hear about that, but it's true. They also had rivalries and they had names. So if we miss that, we misunderstood the whole episode from the very beginning.
That's right, Dr. Weaver, and I really think that changed the whole tone of the story here. If you hear lost colony, then you can imagine a lonely little English outpost isolated in a void. That's what you think of, but that is
Yes.
not at all what this was. They were surrounded by communities who knew the land, the seasons, the food sources, the waterways, and the politics far better than the English did. So the central question here is not just where did the colonists go? It's also whose world were they now trapped inside?
There's another point people often miss. Roanoke was not one single failed experiment. There were multiple English efforts at colonization in the 1580s. The better known Lost Colony of 1587 followed a number of earlier reconnaissance and colonization attempts. By the time that famous group arrived, they were stepping into a place already marked by previous English failure.
And the 1587 colony itself was compromised from the very beginning. According to the National Park Service, that voyage consisted of 118 men, women, and children. This was not just a military outpost. It included families. It was meant to be a more durable settlement. The birth of Virginia Dare, which, maybe we should do a little podcast on her sometime, in 1587, later become symbolic for precisely that reason. She represented continuity, permanence, and the hope that this would become a rooted English society in North America.
And one detail that really changes how we understand their odds is this: Roanoke Island was not even supposed to be their final destination.
Well, where were they going to go?
Well, the colonists were meant to go north to the Chesapeake Bay, which
Aha.
English planners considered more promising for a permanent settlement. But Simon Fernandez, the expedition's captain, well, he had different ideas. He refused to carry them farther and left them at Roanoke. So, right from the very beginning, this colony was already stuck in the wrong place.
So, Chandler, what you're saying, he dropped them there. And the reason he did that was because they'd had some bad weather not long before they made landfall. And he was like, oh, hell no, I'm not going there again.
Yep,
I'm
screw this. Peace out. I'm done. See y'all later. Bye.
A, a similar thing happens 30 years later with the Pilgrims. They're supposed to go to Virginia and end up in Massachusetts.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But that's one of the most important facts in this entire story. It means the lost colony may have been, in part, a stranded colony. The English end up in a location that was never intended to be the final answer to their colonizing problem.
And the problems piled up rather quickly. The colonists arrived in July 1587 and found only the remains of the earlier English presence. Then relations with local Algonquin communities deteriorated again. George Howe was killed, and when the English retaliated, they attacked what they believed was a Sakotan community, a village, but it was actually Croatoan. That mistake likely worsened relationships at exactly the moment the colonists most needed dependable local ties. What a screw up.
Yes, it's a screw up. And that part really stands out to me. If you're under provision in an unfamiliar territory and dependent on local knowledge, the last thing you can afford is to damage the trust of the people around you. And yet, that is exactly what happened. So even before the disappearance, the colony was sitting on a weak food security, shaky diplomacy, and a bad location. It's almost a formula for fragmentation.
By late summer of 1587, Governor James White faced a grim reality. The threat of attack, unreliable access to food, and the approaching winter pushed him to sail back to England for aid. He'd only been on Roanoke for a little over a month. Before leaving, it was agreed that if the colonists departed Roanoke before his return, they would carve their destination into the nearby trees. The National Park Service also notes that one group was expected to remain on Roanoke while another looked inland for a more permanent location and access to supplies.
Then the larger Atlantic world intervened. White expected a quick resupply, but the Spanish Armada crisis changed everything. Queen Elizabeth ordered English vessels to remain available for defense, and White's return was delayed. He did not get back until 1590. In other words, the colonists were left alone for weeks or, or even a season. They were effectively abandoned by circumstances for about 3 years.
For 3 years?
Yes.
My goodness, that gap matters psychologically as much as it does materially. After a while, people stop thinking, oh, help is on the way, and start thinking, well, we have to solve this ourselves. So I think once you picture 3 years instead of a short emergency, the idea that they would relocate starts to seem almost inevitable. They would have had to make a long term decision, not just a temporary adjustment.
When White finally returned on August 18, 1590, he found the settlement abandoned. He found Crow carved into a tree and Croatoan carved into a palisade. The word Croatoan has been associated with numerous disappearances right up to modern times. I think we'll do a podcast on that mystery. He found no signs of a struggle and, very importantly, no evidence that the colonists had left in haste. White attempted to sail for Croatoan, but a storm disrupted that effort, and he never learned what had happened.
And this is the point where the evidence becomes both frustrating and very informative. Empty does not mean obliterated. The houses had been dismantled rather than bashed apart. The site did not present itself as a battlefield. The clue left behind looked intentional. That tends to push historians away from the idea of a sudden on-site catastrophe and towards relocation efforts.
And this is where the word lost can become misleading again. Lost to English records? Yes. Lost to John White? Yes. But possibly not lost in the sense of immediate destruction. If they had the presence of mind to leave a destination marker, then at least some of them were thinking strategically. They were trying to be found, but just not in the place where White expected them to be.
So let's start with the best known and to many historians, the strongest theory that at least some of the colonists moved to Croatoan, often associated with present-day Hatteras Island, and were absorbed into native society there. White himself believed that was the meaning of the carved word. Croatoan was both a people and a place. And Manteo, a Croatoan man friendly to the English, had lived with the colonists. The NPS also notes that artifacts from the lost colony period have been found on Hatteras Island.
Putting on my historian's hat for a minute, what makes this theory attractive is that it begins with the evidence actually left at the scene. We do not have to invent a dramatic extra effort first. We have a destination marker, we have a friendly native connection. We have later archaeological interest on Hatteras. That does not prove the whole colony ended there, but it makes Croatoan the most natural place to begin.
And I think that this is where we need to get past the simplistic phrase absorbed into a tribe, because that can sound too neat. In reality, if this happened, it would have meant dependence, negotiation, translation, intermarriage, labor, alliance, and adaptation. It would mean that the colonists survived by entering native systems, not by imposing English ones. And that is a big mental shift, especially if people are used to the story being told as an English mystery rather than an indigenous contact story.
Well put. It is entirely possible that the disappearance was, in part, cultural as much as physical. A person can disappear from one archive and continue living in another society, and that may be what happened here.
Here's a second major theory, and that is that the colony did not share one single fate. According to the NPS, before White left, it was already determined that the remaining colonists might divide, with some staying on Roanoke and another group seeking a more inland location. That detail matters enormously because it gives us a built-in reason to suspect fragmentation.
Now, I actually think that this may be the best overall framework, even if the exact destinations remain uncertain. Groups under pressure rarely move like chess pieces in perfect unison. Families split. Leadership gets contested. Some people want the safer local options. Others want the bolder long distance move. Some want familiar allies. Others want better farmland. So the question may not be, what happened to the colony? But it may be, what happened to the different parts of the colony?
Yeah, that leads us to the inland Albemarle Sound theory. The NPS notes that White's map included a patch covering a fort-like symbol about 50 miles inland near present-day Bertie County. And White had also left instructions about moving 50 miles inland if they left Roanoke. Archaeological work in Bertie County has uncovered English artifacts that researchers believe may be connected to the colonists, but the same NPS page stresses that no human remains, graves, buildings, or definitive village site have been found, and the artifacts cannot yet be conclusively linked to the lost colony. Now, if they were absorbed by the native culture, they may not have had village sites, and their graves and whatnot may have been subjected to Native American customs on that front. So it's possible.
To me, that's the responsible way to discuss inland evidence. It's intriguing but not conclusive. It may suggest that some survivors moved inland, perhaps to safer or more agriculturally viable ground, but it does not solve the mystery on its own.
Well, to me, Dr. Deneen, that makes the split theory stronger, not weaker. The Croatoan clue may point one way, the inland artifacts may point to another. Instead of forcing those into competition, maybe we should read them together. Some colonists may have gone south toward Croatoan. Some may have gone inland up the Sound. Some may have died on the way. That kind of messy answer is exactly what real historical crises often produce.
And another enduring theory is that the colonists made their way to the Chesapeake Bay, had been the expedition's intended final destination all along. The attraction of this theory is obvious. If you're stranded at the wrong location, maybe eventually you will try to reach the place you wanted in the first place.
That stands to reason. The NPS notes when the Jamestown colonists arrived in the Chesapeake region nearly 20 years later, they heard reports from local Algonquin peoples that early settlers had fought and died there before Jamestown was founded. That report has kept the Chesapeake theory alive, but there is still no archaeological confirmation of a Roanoke settlement there. And the trip required open ocean navigation that the colonists were just not well equipped to manage.
So this one, for me, lands in the it's possible, but not leading category for me. It makes sense as a strategic idea, but it runs into practical problems. Wanting to reach Chesapeake and being capable of getting there safely are two different things. That's especially true for a mixed group of settlers with families, limited supplies, and no strong naval capacity.
We also need to discuss famine and disease because those explanations are often treated as obvious. Hunger and illness were absolutely plausible parts of this story. The National Park Service notes that a major drought struck the Outer Banks in 1587 and lasted for 3 years, limiting food available for trade. Independent tree ring research published in Science magazine likewise identified 1587 to 1589 as the most extreme drought in 800 years for the relevant region.
That is a severe environmental stressor, and we should take it seriously. But famine and disease do not fully explain the evidence at the site. Whit did not find graves that would make a complete die-off at Roanoke especially likely. And he found signs of deliberate departure rather than collapse in place. So hunger and disease may have weakened the colony, killed some colonists, and pushed the survivors to relocate. They make a great deal of sense as part of the explanation, but less sense as the whole explanation.
And that distinction right there, Dr. Weaver, is really important.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah, me too. Asking, did famine kill them? Maybe just a little bit too blunt. A better question might be, did drought make Roanoke untenable and force movement? Now that seems much more plausible to me. Environmental crisis may not tell us the final destination, but it could explain why staying put stopped being realistic.
Okay, let's go to another theory, massacre. This is one of the most dramatic theories and therefore one of the most popular in public imagination.
But the immediate evidence for a massacre at the Roanoke site is weak. White did not report bodies, burned structures, shattered defenses, or any signs of a last stand. In fact, the site looked more like a place vacated with intention than a place overrun in panic. That does not rule out later violence somewhere else. Colonists moving through unfamiliar territory could have been attacked later, but the classic picture of everyone being slaughtered right there at Roanoke is not strongly supported by what White found.
I think massacre survives as a theory partly because people like finality. One attack, one ending, one explanation. But history is often much less tidy.
You got that right.
That's what makes it so interesting to me.
Absolutely, I would have to agree with that. Some may have died violently, others may not have. A single total massacre is actually a cleaner story than the evidence deserves.
Now we have to look at the traditional enemy of the English, the Spanish. Spain always hovers over the Roanoke story, and with a good reason. White's relief was delayed because of the war and the Armada crisis, so in a broad sense, Spain absolutely shaped the colony's fate.
But when we narrow the question to whether the Spanish directly destroyed the colony, the evidence gets thinner. The NPS notes that in 1588, Spanish Captain Vicente Gonzalez searched the Chesapeake and Outer Banks for the English, found evidence of a boat slip near Roanoke, but found no English people. White later saw no signs of a Spanish attack at the abandoned settlement, so a direct Spanish assault on the Roanoke site remains, I guess, possible, but is just not very well supported at all.
So, Dr. Weaver, this just keeps getting more and more mysterious, doesn't it?
Yeah, it kind of does.
It really does. Now, Dr. Deneen, what about the idea that colonists fled to Spanish settlements for safety?
Unfortunately, that's an even weaker idea. St. Augustine had been founded by the Spanish in 1565, and that was a hostile imperial base, not a friendly refuge for English intruders. The Spanish had already shown at Fort Caroline that they were willing and able to destroy rival settlements.
So, yes, Spain mattered enormously, but Spain destroyed them and they sought Spanish protection are two very different claims. The first is unproven, the second is strategically unlikely.
Absolutely, and that does make sense, Dr. Weaver, because Spain is central to the background, but not necessarily to the last scene. Spain explains delay, fear, and imperial pressure more convincingly than it explains the exact disappearance.
Yeah, let's look at the French here. What about the possibility of a flight to French settlements? What do you think?
In the nearby southeastern context, that theory is very weak. Charles Fort, the earlier French outpost in what's now South Carolina, had failed back in 1563. Fort Caroline in Florida was destroyed by the Spanish, as we said, 2 years later in 1565. So by the time the Roanoke colonists disappeared, there was no obvious nearby French sanctuary waiting, at least on that coast.
Absolutely, Dr. Deneen. So, this is one of those theories that sounds reasonable only until you map the timing. Once you do, the flight to the French idea loses a lot of force. There may have been French people elsewhere in the Atlantic world, of course, but not a convenient nearby French colonial refuge.
Another example is a mass return by sea that some of the colonists tried to leave by boat, perhaps going across the coast toward the Chesapeake, perhaps toward some other outpost, perhaps even in the most desperate imagination, all the way back across the Atlantic.
The evidence here is thin, but it's not absurd. White found signs they had departed, and the Spanish search reported a boat slip in the area. So maritime movement is certainly very plausible. What is harder to support is a successful long-distance escape attempt. The farther one pushes the theory from local relocation by water to a transatlantic return effort, it becomes more and more speculative.
Now, this feels like a theory that works best in a limited form. Did some use boats to relocate? Well, that's very possible. Did a sizable family and colony with children and thin provisions manage an attempted return to Europe? Now, that moves this from plausible into highly conjectural. I would not rule it out completely, but I would rank it below Croatoan relocation, inland movement, or some sort of a split scenario.
Yeah, one reason Roanoke remains so compelling, the mystery of Roanoke, is that the evidence gives us direction but not closure. We have a carved message, but no final testimony. We have intriguing archaeological evidence, but no definitive identification of the settlement. We have plausible theories, but no single decisive
And that's
proof.
very important because that means that Roanoke is not a mystery because nothing is known. It's a mystery because just enough is known to support several interpretations without settling any one of them completely. This is a different kind of historical problem.
I also think that Roanoke survives because people keep asking the wrong kind of question. They want one dramatic answer: a massacre, a shipwreck, a Spanish raid, a disappearance into legend. But the more I look at it, the more the likely answer feels distributed and more convolute, might I add. Some
Mhm.
relocation, some hunger, some deaths, some adaptation, some failed searching, some records that were never written, some records written in worlds that the English did not even preserve. That kind of answer is hard to dramatize, but it fits the evidence so much better.
Just going to add one other little tweak here. The word Croatoan has been associated with a creature, I think it was the Powhatans, who said that this Croatoan creature could turn people into trees and plants. I'm not saying I believe that one at all, but hey, who knows? So let's kind of look at these theories all together. Let's give each a concluding view. For me, the strongest explanation is deliberate relocation. Probably not as one intact group, however, but as a colony that fractured under pressure. I think movement towards Croatoan, single strongest destination specific theory, because it begins with the clue White actually found.
My own ranking is similar. First, relocation with at least some settlement among native communities, especially Croatoan linked communities. Second, partial island movement toward the Albemarle Sound region. Third, famine, disease, and drought as major pressures rather than final standalone answers. After that, I would place Chesapeake movement as possible but still unproven, and lower still would be direct Spanish destruction, French refuge, or a long distance escape attempt.
Well, my conclusion is that the colony was probably not lost in a single moment. It was likely broken apart by bad placement, weak provisioning, damaged alliances, drought, and delayed rescue. I think at least some colonists almost certainly relocated. Some may have joined native communities, some may have headed inland, some may have died before any new life stabilized. So, if I had to give the shortest, honest answer here, I'd say this: the lost colony was most likely less a disappearance than just a slow unraveling.
And maybe that is why the story still matters. It reminds us how fragile early colonization really was. It reminds us that maps, plans, and imperial dreams meant a very little when weather, distance, and local realities turned against you.
And it reminds us, too, of a very important fact we often forget. Native indigenous history is not the background of this story, it's the center of it. The colonists' fate, whatever it was in detail, would have been shaped by indigenous power, indigenous geography, and indigenous choices.
Which means that the real mystery here is not just where did the English go? It's what did survival look like once English control over the story ended? And that, to me, is the most interesting question of all.
Well, that's all for today's episode of Things You Don't Know. Thanks for listening. Come on back sometime soon.
Goodbye, folks.
See you next time, folks. Make sure you come back for the next one. We got some good stuff coming up.